toward the end of the book of Deuteronomy, you kind of get a summary statement that we felt like sums up the book really well. And it says, I set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Now choose life. And throughout the whole book of Deuteronomy, you read, do this and don't do this. Do this, don't do this. This will lead to life. This will lead to death. This will lead to blessing. This will lead to curse. And there is this polarizing dichotomy between obedience to God and disobedience to God all throughout the whole book. And so we decided to basically make that the visual grounding for the whole video, and we decided to do that through doors. So we had black doors and white doors, and all spread out over the stage are a bunch of black doors, and then there's one straight line of white doors. So it's kind of, you can think of it like the straight and narrow path that leads to life, or the many circuitous routes that lead to death. And so we felt like we portrayed that in an interesting way through the doors. In the beginning of the video, we see Moses writing in Hebrew on this slate. And a little fun fact, Easter egg, is it's the Shema that he has written in Hebrew. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And so that's what's on the slate, which is cool. And that's because toward the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses has taken this long speech that he's given to the people of Israel on the border of the Promised Land, and God told him to write it down on stone tablets and put those stone tablets inside the Ark of the Covenant so that everywhere the people go as they travel, they would have the law with them. And at bare minimum, every 7 years, they were to take those stone tablets out and read them to everyone. And that was what should have helped them stay true to God's law, to obey Him, to love Him, is by repeating this law over and over again to themselves. So there's a strange tension in the book of Deuteronomy that we tried to capture in this video, and that is in the very book of Deuteronomy that's saying, if you choose to obey me, then you'll have life. If you disobey me, then you'll have death. In that very book that kind of sets up this conditional relationship between humans and God, you also get these promises, these prophetic promises that the people will choose the wrong thing and they will be led into exile and death. And so we ended up making the video about Deuteronomy, not so much about the individual right and wrong choices, the individual laws that God set up. We made it about the story that the book of Deuteronomy is telling, which is you will go astray. You will fall into exile because there's these huge, long prophecies and promises throughout Deuteronomy that guarantee that this will happen. And so we actually feel like telling that side of the story actually helps the narrative arc of Deuteronomy hold together a little bit better than focusing on just the individual laws, which, take a different kind of skill to read. So when people go through black doors, that's them choosing wrong over right. That's them choosing to disobey God instead of obey God. And when they go in, they're in this dark space, all alone. And it doesn't matter if they walk through the door with someone else with them. It doesn't matter if they walk through one of the first doors or one of the last doors. They are isolated in this space and they cannot get out. They are locked outside. And we did that so we could communicate the idea of what was the punishment that would come because of disobedience. And the punishment was exile from the land. So if the white doors lead into the land where they would live with God forever, the black doors are about the time whenever they would be exiled from the land and would not be able to get back in. This should throw us all the way back to the book of Genesis, whenever Adam and Eve were living in the garden with God and they were exiled from the garden, and there was that cherubim with the flaming sword not allowing them to enter back in. That is what was promised would happen if the people disobeyed God's law. They would be exiled from the land, cut off, where they would die. And that's what happens throughout the biblical story. The Assyrians come, the Babylonians come, the Persians come, and they take the people of Israel out of their land. You can read about this in the book of Daniel specifically, is when the Babylonians come and they take some of the Israelites away. And this is the promises of Deuteronomy coming true. The people continue to disobey, they continue to break God's law, and eventually they are all ripped out of Israel and exiled into other lands. With this kind of a visual, it was hard to figure out a way to show someone fulfilling and completing the law. And so what we did was, on the final white door, there was this little shelf. And the whole idea was that was where the law was meant to go. That was the place where it was to be put in the highest esteem, with the most regard, where it was obeyed completely. And so by putting the Shema, the law, on top of that final door, which is what Jesus does in the video, that is a symbol of finally and completely fulfilling and obeying the law. And when that happens, as soon as that occurs and the law touches that place of prominence above the final door, all the black doors open. And what that represents is Jesus reversing the curse, that all the curses that Deuteronomy promises for disobedience actually fell on Jesus, but all the blessings that Jesus earned by obeying the law actually come to us. And so that's why the doors open, because the curse is broken. Jesus took the curse and opened the blessing. So now we can leave exile and come back to the presence of God in a new and better Garden of Eden, a new and better promised land, which will be the new heavens and the new earth when Jesus returns. So there's one person who receives the law from Moses and tries to lead the people the right way through the doors. He holds the law the whole time. And we don't say it in the poem, but this is Joshua for us, who was the successor to Moses' leadership. And we meet him at the very end. We don't meet him at the very end of Deuteronomy, but he is bestowed with Moses' responsibilities at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And then his book, the book of Joshua, follows in the canon. And so we thought it was interesting to basically have Joshua all alone after all the people had rebelled, and we start to hear this promise of a Moses-like prophet who would come and lead the people the way Moses did, and hopefully even better. And we watch, and Joshua enters through the last door because he was a faithful man, but he wasn't able to perfectly obey the law like he was supposed to. And so whether it was Joshua or anyone else throughout the biblical narrative after him, every single person in some way or another, no matter how great they were, broke the law. And so that's when you see him holding up the law and trying to put it in its proper place, but ultimately it falls and it breaks. And that's an image of every leader, every prophet, every king, every judge, every priest ultimately failing at their job and breaking the law. One of my favorite parts of the video is when Joshua falls to his knees and he sees the tablet broken. He sees the law broken. But then he turns over the tablet and he sees that there's this one Hebrew word written on the back. And of course, most people, I probably wouldn't even know it if I just saw it, don't know that Hebrew word on the back of the tablet that he uncovers is the word prophet. And why we put that there was because the promise that God made was for a Moses-like prophet who would come and fulfill everything that the law required. And so I kind of like that idea of there's this broken law, but all the while on the back of it and underneath it and hidden within it is a promise of God that there would be a prophet who would come and fulfill everything that the law required. And as soon as he turns that tablet over, you see Jesus' feet right next to the tablet, and he looks up and he sees Jesus because he is the prophet that the tablet prophesied about. So I just love that image. After the doors are all opened, you see Jesus open one final black door and rescue a little girl out from exile. And then everyone is back here at the front of the stage, at the front of the two doors. And the poem talks about how they're on the border of a new and better promised land, which is coming. And that new and better promised land for Christians is not a physical, geographical, socio-political region. It is the kingdom of heaven. And we get to live in that now with the reality that God lives in us and rules and reigns in us and over this world. But it's also looking forward to a time when Jesus will return and make the whole earth into a new Garden of Eden, a new promised land where we will live with him forever, which is kind of the picture you get of Jesus standing at the final white door with all that white behind him, gesturing to the people to come to him and dwell with him forever. And so that's the border that we stand on today in this world. We stand on the border of a new and better promised land. And the same choice that the law presented to Israel, it's presented to us today, that we now must choose right over wrong. Just because Jesus fulfilled the law does not mean that we get to break the law. That's not what that means. It means that he earned everything that the law required to be earned and credited it to us. But that doesn't mean that we're free from obeying it. In fact, we are still required to obey it. And so the question that Deuteronomy asks us today is, well, if no one could ever obey the law, how on earth are we going to finally obey the law? And that's why we show the image of Jesus taking the white doors off their hinges, because Jesus enables us to go into the places of obedience that we never could before. Jesus enables us to actually obey the law like we never could before. And that might seem like a bunch of optimistic mumbo jumbo if it weren't for one very specific truth, and that is, how does Jesus enable us to obey the law? And the answer to that question is he gives us himself. He dwells in us through his Spirit. So he who on earth obeyed the law perfectly now comes and resides in us so that we can obey the law. Now, there's this one final moment in the video that I think provides a lot of good news and relief for us, and that is when we see the very first person who went astray in the video. We see him at the edge of one of the open white doors, and instead of going through, he turns aside and goes to one of the black doors again. But as he reaches for the black door, he tries to open it, and it's locked. He actually cannot go through it, even though he wants to. And right there in that moment communicates a lot for me. The one is, just because we have the Holy Spirit living in us doesn't mean we're instantly going to behave perfectly. We are already seen as perfect, and we are legally declared as perfect because Jesus has obeyed the law for us. But the process of becoming like Jesus and becoming obedient Torah followers doesn't happen overnight. That is the process of sanctification that the Bible talks about, the process of becoming holy, of the Holy Spirit taking over more and more of our lives. And so I love that little moment where the open path to life is there in front of him, and instead he turns and goes to darkness, because, man, we do that all the time. But there's good news, and the good news is, even when you choose wrong, if you are a Christian, the pathway to death and condemnation and exile is locked to you. You cannot be condemned if you are a Christian. If you continue to have faith in Jesus and persevere to the end, Jesus will have you. He will change your heart. He will take over all your wrong choices and make them right. He will continually forgive you, continually be compassionate for you or toward you. And that's why we show Jesus watching this man go to the wrong door, try to get in, and yet there's Jesus right there, showing him that there's no condemnation, that there's forgiveness. And then we show Jesus walking him through the white door together to give us an even more visceral image of the fact that even the worst of us sinners, Jesus will come alongside, change, and lead down the path to life.